Okay, welcome back. This is Module 5, Lecture 1. We're going to be talking about social groups. A social group, the easiest and most complete definition, the most inclusive definition, is people who interact with one another on a regular basis and believe themselves to have some purpose for belonging together. Okay? Again, that's a very, very, very broad definition, and probably easier to kind of eliminate some of the things that social groups are not. So as we have written up here, social groups are not aggregates. Aggregate is just a term used to describe a bunch of people who happen to be in the same place at the same time. For instance, a bunch of people taking a plane, a bunch of people attending a concert or in a restaurant at the same time. Okay? We wouldn't necessarily call those social groups for a couple of reasons. One is it doesn't fulfill one of the definitions, people who interact on a consistent basis. So a bunch of people getting on a plane basically are going to be together for the duration of that flight, and chances are when that plane gets to its destination, that group of people will be broken up and probably never get together again. So we would not necessarily call that a social group. It's just a bunch of people who happen to be in the same place at the same time, and we call that an aggregate. Social groups are also not categories. Categories are people who happen to share a similar characteristic or characteristics. So this could perhaps be physical characteristics like being left-handed, or having red hair, or people who wear glasses. Okay, those people share a similar characteristic, but are not necessarily considered a social group. Again, those are physical characteristics. It could also be economic characteristics. For instance, you wouldn't necessarily call all people who make exactly $49,872 a year a social group. Okay, all those people share a similar economic characteristic, but they're not people who we would consider a social group, again, because of that second part of the definition, which is people who believe that they have some purpose to be together. Now, that's not to say that aggregates and categories can become social groups, okay? Or a better way of putting that is, can social groups form from aggregates and categories? And the answer is absolutely yes. So going back to our plane example, so a bunch of people board a plane, and let's say something unusual, probably actually very scary in most cases, probably happens, an engine fails, or there's some type of trauma associated with that trip, and those people who arrive safely, or there's I'm going to use a happier version, everybody arrives safely, but those people decide to keep in touch with one another. Those people decide to maybe form a group to commemorate the event that they lived through, or they maybe get together to petition for greater airline safety, or to kind of protest or form a class action lawsuit against whatever happened to them. Okay, those people now are consistently meeting on a regular basis and feel themselves in some ways to belong together. You could say that now a social group has formed from that aggregate. Again, another example would be a bunch of people go to a concert and meet each other and decide that that band that they've all gone to see is their favorite band, and they form a fan club. Okay, now we've seen a social group form from an aggregate. Social groups forming from categories, again, very similar. So a bunch of people who share a similar economic characteristic, such as a specific salary or an economic condition, decide to get together and, like I said, maybe form a labor union, or petition for better pay or benefits, those kind of things. Even the physical characteristics, a bunch of people who form the left-handed society and get together and celebrate the fact of their left-handedness would be an example of a category forming from, or I'm sorry, a social group forming from a category. So when we talk about, like I said, this very inclusive definition of social groups is just people who interact consistently and believe themselves to belong together. We obviously see that includes very many things. But the most important thing is the importance of social groups to our definition of ourselves as human beings. We define ourselves to a large part as social beings, as the groups that we belong to, and the groups that we belong to have a very powerful effect on shaping who we are and how we regard ourselves. Toward that, we can talk about just a general way of breaking down the types of groups that we belong to into two types: primary and secondary groups. Okay? Primary, we often talk about the importance of primary groups, and George Horton Cooley, who we've mentioned before, used the term springs of life to refer to primary groups in his discussion of the importance of them. Again, a spring, just water welling up from the ground around which things grow. So Cooley was basically referring to the importance of primary groups as being those parts or those groups that we belong to that are the biggest part of making us who we are. For most of us, we would probably regard our primary groups, if we were asked to describe them, as usually our family and friends. And we talk about the importance of primary groups to who we are. Clearly, as we're growing up throughout life as children, usually it's our family, for better or for worse, that is the largest influence on who we are, our identity and sense of self. And then later on, sometimes friends. When we talk about over life course, and certainly when we talk about teenagers, we talk about that time when our friends, to a certain degree, become more important to us than our family. And then usually as adults, we have a pretty healthy mixture, to some degree, of family and friends who we consider our closest sources of emotional support, our confidants, those people that we spend the majority of time with. So when we talk about primary groups, we generally think of them in positive terms, and we usually think about it in the typical way as mainly friends and family. That's not necessarily to say that all primary groups, by definition, are positive. Sociologists who study gangs have come to refer to gangs, especially among, like I said, adolescents and young people, as a primary group. Okay? Early, when gang behavior became a problem in America, kind of the early thoughts about it was just sit down with the kids, discuss with them the negative aspects of joining gangs. You can basically, the theory was you could talk a child out of a gang. And of course that was horribly unsuccessful until it was realized that gangs fulfill a lot more features of a primary group than originally thought. So when we talk about why do children join gangs and why is it often very hard to get people out of gangs, we look at it in terms of primary groups. We realize gangs are a source of structure, they're a source of identity, they're a sense of belonging. So all the things that we sometimes think of as the primary functions of family are being served by gangs for a lot of individuals. So much like it would be very difficult for any of us to have, as children, been talked out of leaving our family, it's also just that difficult to talk youth out of joining gangs or leaving gangs once they've joined. So we can clearly see that primary groups are pretty critical for our sense of development. Secondary groups are those larger, more formal groups that we generally join kind of at a voluntary basis or voluntary associations. So it's usually based on joining groups of other people with whom we either have similar interests or we could say that we're working toward a common goal. So when we think about when you think about yourself as an individual, I think about myself, I can clearly talk about the primary groups that I've had and continue to have in my lifetime, but then we kind of expand the circle and we say, okay, what kind of secondary groups I belong to is usually a much larger list. But once again, when we look at the relationships we have with the individuals in those groups tend to be, as I said, much more formal, less intense associations with those individuals, and it's much more likely, as I said, that we do those things basically on a voluntary basis, or a sense of I'm doing this because I want to. So examples of things would be classes in schools. This would be co-workers, voluntary associations such as clubs, organizations, like I said, labor unions, PTAs, social clubs, all sorts of things that we do on a regular basis, kind of that are voluntary associations. Another thing that we could discuss here when we talk about the importance of the groups that we join is when we join groups to a certain degree, the groups that we choose to associate with, or in some cases, especially in the case of primary groups, groups that we sometimes belong to out of largely kind of involuntary, especially earlier in life, give us a sense of how then we will relate to other people in other groups. And we refer to that phenomenon basically as the discussion of in-groups and out-groups. In-groups are the groups to which we will generally feel a sense of loyalty or friendliness toward. So if a group that we've joined or belong to feels generally a sense of camaraderie or acceptance with another group, then we will also tend to feel that way toward the individuals in that group. So by definition, the groups we join affect how we feel about other people. Conversely, if a group we've joined feels hostility or a sense of competition with another group, then we might consider that group or its members to be an out group to us. Okay? So let's go back to our example of primary groups, and let's use gangs for a second, because we were just talking about that. So let's say you live in an urban situation in which there are rival gangs. So if you join the Bloods, then you're going to feel, again, a sense of in-group toward other blood gangs or gangs that are affiliated with your gang. And who will be your out-group? Well, again, if we're talking about the famous rivalry between gangs, then if you are a member of the Bloods, then your out-group is the Crips. And your distinction or your behavior is going to be affected by your group's definitions of who you can and cannot associate with. So if you are, let's again using that example, a member of the Crips, it would be completely unacceptable to your group for you to pal around with or be friends with a member of the Bloods. You could say, well, this person's been a friend of mine my entire life, and yet your group would say that's an unacceptable relationship for you to have, and you would probably run afoul of the group for doing that. Again, secondary groups, very similar. If you are, let's say, a member of the Republican Party, then you are probably, for in-groups, you will probably ingratiate yourself to things like the Chamber of Commerce or the NRA, and feel that those groups are supporting the same type of values and goals that you and your group have, whereas you might feel a sense of antagonism or just out-group with, let's say, a group like Democrats or social welfare organizations. Anything that doesn't support the beliefs and values of your group would be considered an out-group. All right? That brings us to the next point of reference groups. When we talk about reference groups, these are usually groups in some ways that we use to evaluate or describe ourselves as individuals. So think about when you introduce yourself to somebody, or you are at maybe, let's say, a job interview, or talking to a large group of people for the first time. You'll often refer to the groups that you belong in a sense, to describe to a large degree who you are and what some of your values or beliefs or interests are. So if I were to meet you for the first time and we're getting to know each other, and I mention that I'm the president of the local PTA, you would probably make several assumptions about that. One, that I'm a parent. Two, that I have children of the school age. And three, that I have a very strong interest or see a benefit in participating in an organization to try to make the education system better. Okay, it would be very unusual probably for me to introduce myself and say I'm a member of the PTA, or better yet, president of the PTA, and then for you to say, oh, you have children, and I say, No, absolutely not. As a matter of fact, I don't like children at all. Okay? Strange thing for the member or the president of the PTA to say. Okay? So a lot of times when we describe to people ourselves in terms of or in reference to the groups that we belong to, we're referring to, obviously, reference groups. In reference to groups, when we associate with groups, we form social networks. Okay? Obviously, these are all the people that we are linked to in society. And again, if you're familiar with the online service, clearly a lot of the times when we think of social networks and social networking, things like Facebook come to mind. And I just mentioned when I use the term linked, a lot of times for professional reasons, people join an online group called LinkedIn, which again will describe not only the people that you're linked to, but then by association, how you know other people through those people. And that's basically, when you think of the concept of reference groups, you can kind of think about yourself and then connections out to all the other people that you know, and then those people are connected obviously to other people, and you can measure your connection to other people in society to a large degree. In fact, that's exactly the word, by degrees. Right? So I am this person linked to that person who's linked to that person. This is led to and has sometimes been called a couple of different things. One is the small world phenomenon, if you've ever heard that term before, or you can think of where you've heard that term. You meet somebody and it turns out they know somebody that you know, and then by definition you feel in some way connected to that person. You may use the term then, wow, it's a small world. So the small world phenomenon is that concept that people in a society are technically linked to each other by their connections closest to them. And this has led to kind of there was a notion for a period of time that actually made itself into, led itself to becoming quite a party game called 6 Degrees of Separation. The idea that in any society, any two people could be linked within, quote unquote, kind of 6 steps or 6 links or 6 degrees to every other person in society. This led to the party game, and I don't know how this particular actor ever got chosen for it, but when we talk about that, if anybody's ever heard of this, 6 Degrees to Kevin Bacon. The idea that if you were, let's say, at a party and people were playing this game, it would be your job to describe within 6 moves your connection to a famous person, in this case the actor Kevin Bacon. So you would say, I know this person who, this is my friend who went to college with this person who lives in Los Angeles, whose gardener also works for the producer of one of Kevin Bacon's movies. The idea that, within that many moves, you would be able to link yourself to another person in society. And the theory was, as I said, that, and when you think about it, everyone in society should be equally linked to everybody else in society, but clearly sociologists have kind of debunked that there are definitely barriers to people becoming equally linked to everybody else in society. Some of those barriers, definitely social class. We definitely know that people tend to associate with people of a closer social class than themselves. So in other words, kind of rich people know more rich people, middle class know more middle class, poor meaning linked to more poor people. We definitely know that gender is another, that men tend to know more men and be associated with them. Women tend to know more women and be associated with them, as well as race and ethnicity also becoming a barrier in a lot of cases to this idea of quote-unquote kind of perfect social networking. The very last thing that we could talk about, and this is what we might call kind of an emerging quality of social groups. One of the things when we talked about social groups, past definition may have included the idea that at least all these people in social groups have to live in some kind of proximity to one another. That usually people live in the same geographic location or have some type of connection with one another, generally that we usually think about in person. Clearly, technology has changed to the point of saying that we've needed to change our definition of social groups to allow for the fact that with modern technology, especially the invention of the internet, we could say that it is now possible to fulfill the definition of social groups and never actually meet in person or be in the same room or even sometimes the same town or city as other people within your social group. And we call these electronic communities. So they fulfill all the functions of a social group, people who get together for a common interest, who feel themselves to belong together, working towards similar goals, but who do so completely online. And again, some of you may join gaming groups or online chat rooms or just converse with people on a regular basis to share interests with people that you've never met in person or engaging exactly in that type of